In a small, tight-knit town, there was a restaurant that everyone knew. Its owner, Carl, had built it up from the ground with his hard work and sharp business sense. People admired his ability to run a smooth operation, but few saw the coldness that came with his focus on profit. Carl was a man who believed in tough love and always looked out for his bottom line. Compassion had little room in his world. One late afternoon, a weary figure walked into the restaurant. His name was James, a homeless veteran who had seen the harshest of life. His clothes were worn and tattered, his face lined with exhaustion, and his eyes reflected a deep sadness that came from too many battles, both on and off the battlefield. Yet, despite the weight of his circumstances, James held his head high. He had learned that survival was about resilience, no matter how beaten down life made him feel. James sat down quietly and ordered a simple meal. He had no intention of eating anything extravagant, just something to fill his empty stomach. But when the time came to pay, he fumbled for his wallet and realized, to his horror, that he had no money. His heart sank as Carl, who was busy managing the bustling restaurant, noticed the situation unfolding. With no patience for such problems, Carl walked over, his voice cold and stern. "Out," Carl said, his tone carrying the weight of finality. The restaurant fell silent as the eyes of every diner turned to James. The humiliation was unbearable, and the young man stood up, his face flushed with shame. Carl had no sympathy. To him, a man without money had no place in his establishment. James left, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Carl to focus on the next customer without a second thought. But James's humiliation was only the beginning of a far bigger story that was about to unfold. James wandered aimlessly through the streets, his mind heavy with humiliation. The shame of being thrown out of the restaurant burned deep, the sting of Carl's harsh words echoing in his ears. He was used to being overlooked, to people not giving a second glance at him, but it was different this time. This was the place he had hoped could offer him a small sense of dignity, a moment of peace in his otherwise chaotic life. Instead, he was tossed aside like trash, and it cut deeper than he was willing to admit. His pride kept him from asking for help. It always had. He was a soldier once, trained to stand tall, to face the toughest of challenges, to push through the pain. But that strength felt like a distant memory now, buried beneath layers of struggle and regret. Since leaving the military, James had found the world to be a place that no longer cared for him. His skills had no place in civilian life, and his mind, forever scarred by the horrors of war, was now his prison. As he walked the streets, he thought about how veterans like him were often forgotten. Society painted them as heroes when it was convenient, but when the cheers died down, when the flags were folded, they were left to fend for themselves. The sacrifices they made were rarely acknowledged, and their struggles were often ignored. James thought back to the battles he had fought, both on the front lines and within himself. The trauma never left him, following him through every waking moment, yet despite it all, he kept moving forward. He had no choice but to keep going, even if it felt like he was walking in circles, lost and alone. Each day was a battle to survive, but his inner strength, no matter how faint, refused to let him give up completely. Carl had always prided himself on being a businessman. The restaurant, his pride and joy, was the culmination of years of blood, sweat, and tears. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for. Every success, every dollar he made, had been earned through sheer determination and an unwavering focus on the goal. There was no room for distractions, no room for weakness. He had built his empire from the ground up, and in the process, he had hardened himself. Years of sleepless nights and endless work had turned Carl's heart cold. He'd learned the hard way that showing kindness could be dangerous. People could take advantage of a soft heart, and he had no intention of letting that happen to him. His restaurant was his world, and no one, not even the poorest soul, could threaten that. His employees knew this, and the customers respected it, even if they didn't always like him. Carl didn't care about being liked, he cared about staying on top. As he sat in his office, reviewing the books, Carl couldn't help but reminisce about his younger years. He remembered when he had nothing, when his only goal was to survive and find a way out of his struggles. He had been poor, living in a small apartment above a rundown convenience store. But he had worked hard, day and night, to build a life. His early years had been filled with constant rejection, and he had learned quickly that no one was going to hand him anything. He had to fight for every inch, and he did. Success, in Carl's eyes, was earned through strength and grit. Compassion, in his world, was a weakness. But that was all about to change. The day after throwing James out, Carl was sitting at his desk when the phone rang. It was his lawyer, and the news wasn't good. His restaurant was under threat of a lawsuit due to health violations. Carl's blood ran cold. He had thought he had taken care of everything, that all the paperwork and inspections were in order. But apparently he was wrong. The violations were serious, and now the restaurant was facing the possibility of huge fines and legal trouble. Carl's mind raced as the weight of the situation settled in. This was the last thing he needed. His pride had always kept him strong, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. He was going to fight it, he told himself. He always fought, but deep down he knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The next morning, Carl's nightmare became a reality. He was still reeling from the phone call with his lawyer when the health inspector arrived without warning. Carl had hoped that maybe it was a mistake, that the violations would be small, that the issue would be easily fixed. But as the inspector went through the restaurant with a sharp eye, ticking off item after item on the list, Carl's heart sank. Each violation was more serious than the last, from faulty equipment to improperly stored food, to issues with sanitation that Carl had hoped would go unnoticed. The inspector didn't hold back. He shut the restaurant down immediately, posting a large notice on the front door. The bustling restaurant, the place Carl had worked so hard to build, was now silent, its doors locked. Carl's head spun. He tried to plead with the inspector, arguing that he could fix everything, but it was no use. He was informed that there would be a hefty fine, and if things didn't improve quickly, the restaurant could face permanent closure. Carl was left standing outside, the notice of closure hanging on the door like a final punch to the gut. His world, built brick by brick, was crumbling before him. His mind raced, trying to figure out what he could do. Was there a way to get around this? Was there a loophole he could exploit? But the more he thought, the more he realized that there was no quick fix. He was in too deep. The restaurant was more than just a business. It was his identity, his success. Without it, he was nothing. As Carl stood in front of the locked doors, fighting the wave of panic rising within him, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find a figure standing in front of him, a familiar face, but one he hadn't expected to see. It was James, the veteran he had thrown out the day before. James stood at a distance, his posture strong, his eyes steady. He had clearly returned to the town after wandering, perhaps looking for another place to rest or a meal. But today he wasn't the same man Carl had humiliated the day before. James watched Carl silently, his gaze piercing. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough. Carl felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had thought about James only briefly since the incident, dismissing him as just another problem. But now, seeing the man standing before him, something shifted in Carl. The desperation in his own situation made him painfully aware of the cruelty he had shown James. He had tossed a man out, humiliated him for no reason, and now he was standing in front of him, facing the very same consequences of his own actions. The weight of the situation pressed down on Carl as he realized that karma had arrived. James, once the object of Carl's scorn, was now an unexpected symbol of justice. The humiliation Carl had once inflicted on James now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a quiet understanding of the reality he faced. James didn't say anything. He simply stood there, watching Carl with a quiet strength, not offering sympathy, but something more powerful, a reminder that the world had a way of balancing things out. The very man Carl had thrown away was now the one who witnessed his downfall. For the first time, Carl was truly humbled. The restaurant, his empire, might be gone, but the lesson he was about to learn would stay with him far longer than any business ever would. Carl's world crumbled piece by piece after the restaurant's closure. He spent days scrambling, trying to find a solution, but it was as though every attempt he made to fix the situation only made it worse. His staff, who had been loyal to him for years, began to leave one by one. The word spread quickly. Carl's restaurant was no longer the thriving place it had once been, and no one wanted to work for a man on the brink of financial ruin. With each resignation, Carl's sense of control slipped further away. His lawyer, the one person who had always promised to help him navigate through legal trouble, now demanded an even higher fee to handle the lawsuit. The money he had once spent freely was draining away faster than he could replenish it. The lawsuit's potential fines were mounting, and Carl couldn't afford to fight them. To make matters worse, the community that had once supported his restaurant turned its back on him. The local press caught wind of the health violations, and soon people began questioning his ethics. Former customers, who once praised his business, now spoke about how Carl had treated people like James, the homeless veteran, with disdain. The once bustling restaurant was a symbol of his downfall, a place where pride and greed had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. Carl, sitting alone in his empty office, realized just how far he had fallen. The empire he had built with so much effort and heart was now nothing but a memory. It was hard for him to accept, but it was the truth. And for the first time in years, he felt truly helpless. Meanwhile, James continued to live his life. He didn't gloat, nor did he seek revenge. He had learned over time that life had its own way of balancing things out, even when it didn't seem fair. The humiliation he had faced the day before felt distant now, and while his life was far from easy, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that karma had arrived. It wasn't about vengeance for James. It was about peace, about knowing that, no matter how hard things got, there was always a greater force at work. But life had another twist in store. Several weeks later, as Carl walked down the streets, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his struggles, he saw a figure in the distance. It was James. The veteran was standing there, looking at him. Carl's initial instinct was to turn away, to avoid facing the man he had once humiliated. But this time, James didn't turn away. He stepped forward, and with a quiet but steady voice, he said, "I know what you're going through." Carl's heart skipped a beat. The man he had once thrown out, the man who had endured so much, was now offering Carl a chance to make things right. "I've been there," James continued. "I've hit rock bottom too, but there's always a way back, even when it feels like there's none left. If you want to rebuild, I can help. You don't have to do it alone." Carl stood frozen, his pride battling with his desperation. He had been the one to push James away, to treat him like nothing, and now, the same man was offering him help. For the first time in months, Carl felt something other than frustration or anger. He felt the weight of his mistakes, but also, perhaps for the first time, a sense of humility. His walls had come down, and in that moment, he realized that maybe James, the very person he had treated so cruelly, was the key to his redemption. Carl accepted the offer, broken but ready to listen. And as the two men walked side by side down the street, Carl understood something powerful. Sometimes, it takes losing everything to find what truly matters, and in James he found a man who knew what it meant to fight, to survive, and to forgive. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Carl was ready to rebuild, not just his business, but his life. Life often works in mysterious ways, and Carl's downfall was a stark reminder of that. In the span of just a few weeks, he had gone from the proud owner of a successful restaurant to a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. His heart, once cold and hardened by years of business and pride, had been softened in a way he never expected. The very man he had humiliated, James, was the one who now offered him the chance to rebuild, not just his business, but his character. James, despite his own suffering and struggles, remained the stronger of the two. His resilience, shaped by years of hardship, was something Carl could never have understood until he experienced his own downfall. While Carl had focused on building an empire of wealth, James had built a foundation of strength and humility through his suffering. In the end, James didn't need to seek revenge or gloat. His quiet strength, his ability to forgive and move forward, was a lesson Carl would never forget. James had taught Carl the most important lesson of all: the power of kindness, and the destructive nature of pride. Carl's journey of redemption had just begun, and though the road ahead would be long, he now understood that true success wasn't measured by profits, but by the way one treated others. The town, too, had learned something valuable from Carl's fall. It was a reminder to never forget the humanity behind every struggle, to show compassion, and to recognize that life's cycles of karma were never far away. As Carl walked beside James, he understood that sometimes, life's greatest lessons come in the most unexpected ways. And the cycle of karma, it seemed, was always in motion. Thank you for watching this powerful story. It's a reminder that standing up for yourself with courage and dignity can make a huge impact, not just on others, but on the world around you. We hope this story inspired you and left you thinking about the importance of respect and understanding. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that can move and inspire you. Thank you for being part of this journey.